Hello and welcome to another Celebrity Face reading. My name is Taylor and today we'll be looking at none other than the infamous Nicholas J. Fuentes. Now, I'm not a Groyber or anything, but I've been keeping tabs on this guy for a while. He's a very fascinating figure, especially in terms of his political longevity. He has become kind of a household name, kind of the face of the radical, nationalistic, white nationalist, anti-Semitic right online and somewhat in person as well. He's sort of the go-to guy to bring on podcasts if you want the most controversial out there far right kind of take on race, Israel, Jewish influence, and so kind of spicy, definitely the most controversial figure that I've covered. But I've got no worries about it. I'm not here to talk about politics. I'm here to analyze his face and let you know what it tells us about his personality. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. And we're going to start off with his phenotype, which is more or less his biological race, how his genes and heritage express themselves in his physical appearance. Now, I know that he is obviously part Hispanic from the last name and from other things that I've heard, but I really don't see it in the appearance. I don't see much Native American, and I don't even see that much Spanish. What he looks like to me is very Irish. Specifically, he exhibits a really strong example of the Brun phenotype. Brun is a Cro-Magnon phenotype. It's very common along the Atlantic coast of Europe, in northern and western Europe, especially in more isolated mountainous village areas. Brun is one of the very typical Irish types, and you see that with him. Strong brow ridge, deep set eyes, short, almost snub nose, and that kind of thick, wavy mop of brown hair on the top of the head with those green eyes. It looks very Brun to me. He's partially alpinized as well, which leads to some extra shortness of the nose, some increased softness, decreased robustness to the features, gives him that sort of look. Alright, with that out of the way, we're going to get into his physiognomy, his personality characteristics. We're going to start with his side profile, which will tell us a little bit about his temperament and his inborn traits. As you can see here, if you've been following me for a bit, you might say, oh, he's a sanguine, a pure sanguine. But I would caution against that. He's tilting his head up quite a bit. He's posing for the mugshot. If we edit it and tilt it down a bit, we see his actual side profile, which is mostly sanguine, but not entirely. You see, he's actually a sanguine choleric mix. He has a sanguine forehead and a sanguine chin, but a choleric jawline. This is actually the opposite of my temperament, which is a choleric forehead and chin with a sanguine jawline. So what does this mean about his personality? Well, the sanguine type is very outgoing, optimistic, friendly, courageous, kind of kingly and regal, somewhat self-centered in that way where they want to be the center of attention, they want to be in charge, but it's not in a micromanaging or controlling way. It's very much in a heroic, lion-like sort of way. Sanguines make great athletes, actors, salesmen, military officers, soldiers, or in this case, live streamers. They are well suited for live streaming, especially stuff like live debate. However, the choleric jawline means that unlike a typical sanguine, which is more of a short-term runner, they kind of lose interest and energy pretty quickly in long-term endeavors, he actually has the long-term energy of action of the choleric type, which is defined by its long-term endurance and intense energy. So this means that he's going to be more sanguine and optimistic, impulsive, impatient in his intellect and immediate action, but in the long term, he's going to be a lot more stable, a lot more focused, a lot more locked in terms of his work and his projects. Now, that all sounds very positive, and it is, but the downside comes in social situations. He's going to be very charismatic and outgoing and friendly and optimistic and generous and very sanguine in his personal interactions when first meeting people. But as they get to know him and as things get more routine, more serious, more long-term, he's going to become a lot more austere, cold, serious, and choleric. Alright, with that out of the way, we're going to now look at his face shape, which will tell us about his personality archetype and the broad strokes of his personality in general. As you can see here, in his youth, he had a very strong Venus face shape. That's that diamond face shape. That means that he had the diplomat personality archetype. He was very friendly, very focused on loving and being loved, on social causes and aesthetics, and on making peace. He wanted to bring warring parties to the negotiating table to get them to agree. But it wasn't a pure Venus. There's also a square Earth element there, which would express itself in some extra practicality, groundedness, spunkiness, a sort of lively, practical kind of intelligence, and I think in his traditionalism. I can remember actually back in the internet blood sports days, if you can remember that absolute dumpster fire, he was known as the optics guy. He was the guy who would come out and say, hey guys, maybe we shouldn't be walking around flying swastika flags and yelling Siege Heil or whatever. Maybe we should try to present ourselves nice. Maybe we should look good. Maybe we should present ourselves well. Maybe we should be friendly and understanding and practical with our messaging, which I think you can see is very much a Venus-Earth combination. That combination of good aesthetics, peacemaking, putting your argument out there in understandable terms, and earthy sort of pragmatism. And now in the present day, he still very much has that square earth element there, so he's still very pragmatic, practical, and his intelligence quite grounded. But that Venus element has gone out the window in exchange for its opposite, a Mars face shape. That's that rectangular face shape. This is the warrior archetype. This means that nowadays he is far more impatient, impulsive, very intense feeler. He loves and hates with equal intensity. Other examples of Mars face shapes would be people like Donald Trump or Elon Musk. And you can see how the tempers run hot with those personalities. They have a strong impulse to fight, and this can be a very good thing. This can drive them to fight for a political agenda, for example, but it can also hurt relationships. As the old saying goes, Nick Fuentes has been kicked out of 109 friendships, and that is a Mars face shape thing. That probably didn't used to happen to him, but he is so hot-blooded now, he's so dedicated to his cause that the tempers flare up and he's out of the relationship. That bridge is burned. But again, that's a Mars phase thing. You got to take the bad with the good. It happened with Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Or you look at a non-political example of two Mars phase shapes in a relationship. Look at Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, both pure Mars phase shapes, and the relationship ran hot but extinguished quickly. So it makes sense to me that someone like Nick Fuentes with a Mars phase shape, that aggressive warrior archetype, and someone like Keith Woods, who has a pretty pure Mercury face shape, that's that triangular face shape, which is very sensitive, attention-seeking, intellectual. You get that warrior archetype combined with that magician archetype. They're going to be a powerful combination for a while, but eventually they're going to start to clash. Tempers are going to flare. The Mars face person is going to be too aggressive. The Mercury face person is going to be too sensitive, and they're going to split ways. And we saw that's what happened. The last thing I'll say on his face is that he has quite a small inner face, which means that he is quite stress-resistant, aloof, and maybe a bit detached as well. Alright, now we're going to look at his facial features, which will help fill in the minute details of his personality. We're going to start from the top with his eyebrows. They are quite thick naturally, as you can see, but it looks like they are thinning somewhat. This means that while he naturally has a lot of energy and stamina, and it's quite intense, it has been wearing thin recently, and he's been losing energy. It's not that severe, but it's present for sure. His eyebrows are long, which means that he is a pretty patient person who likes to plan things out. He's very premeditated in his action. He likes to draw these big, long, multi-year long plans for his political and personal projects. They are quite low set, however, which means that he's pretty quick and decisive when it comes to judgments. He doesn't take a long time to ascertain all the facts and get everything together before he comes to an emotional judgment of someone or something. He makes those judgments pretty quickly. They're snap judgments. And the last thing I'll mention is that there's a very strong asymmetry with his eyebrows. His left eyebrow in his youth was pretty straight, but now it's pretty sharply arched. This means that his decision-making process in his private life and in personal affairs is quite logical, in addition to being quite competitive, and it shows in general that he has a strong need for control. But his right eyebrow, which shows his decision-making process in his public life, in his professional life, and especially his outer persona that he puts on for the world, is much more amenable and conciliatory. It's very round, which means that he makes decisions in those fields based much more on the consensus of others and based on the feelings of those around him. Alright, now we're going to look at his eyes, which will tell us about his perception and worldview. Now in his youth, they were quite large, very open, innocent, youthful eyes. This means that he was open, innocent, and naive in his worldview. He was very open to others, very trusting, but as you can see over time, they got a lot smaller. This means that he became a lot more cynical and distrusting over time. They are almond-shaped, both in his youth and now, which means that his worldview is based on logic. He sees the world through the lens of his intellect. They are quite deep-set, which means that he's a pretty calculating person. He generally thinks before he speaks. He's pretty withdrawn and likes to sort of sit back and observe and watch before coming in with what he's going to say. They are also quite wide-set, Not too much, it's subtle, but it's there. They're more wide set than close set for sure, which means that he's focused on the big picture. He doesn't get caught up too much in minute details. He's focused on the big picture and the situation as a whole. Now, in spite of his more pugnacious kind of attitude with that Mars face shape, that sanguine temperament, he actually has a slightly negative canthal tilt, which means that he is generally actually a pretty nice guy, somewhat conciliatory, maybe more on the people-pleasing side at times. It's pretty subtle, so not quite a full-on people-pleaser, maybe, but he's pretty considerate of the interest of others. His upper eyelids are quite thin, which means that he has a pretty small need for intimacy and personal connection. He is a pretty independent person and can go it alone pretty well. Finally, his irises are green, which means that he has a dreamy, imaginative, and very spiritual worldview. Alright, now we're going to take a quick look at his ears, which will tell us about how he relates to other people. They're pretty wide splayed, which means that he is a pretty independent and nonconformist person. No surprise there, he makes his bread and butter off of controversy and contrarianism, many would say. And his left ear is actually more wide splayed than his right ear is. So in his professional and public life, he's actually more conformist and less contrarian than he is by nature, which is interesting and somewhat counterintuitive to what people say about him, that he puts on contrarianism as a show. It seems like he's actually kind of hiding his power level here, and we'll get more into that later. The last thing on his ears is that the top third of his ears bulge. It's subtle, but it's there, which means that he prioritizes intellectual and abstract matters over material or social ones. Now we're going to take a look at his nose, which will tell us about his behavior and disposition in general. It's pretty short, which means that he's a pretty action-oriented person. He wants to go out and do things and get stuff done rather than just sitting and thinking about it and mulling it over. It was much shorter in his youth, but it has lengthened over time, and the shape has actually changed somewhat as well. It used to have more of that typical kind of Irish snub shape, but it's straightened out over time, which means that he's gotten more steady, reliable, cool-headed, and rational over time. Finally, the tip of his nose is quite round, which means that he is naturally a kind person. Now we're going to quickly touch on his philtrum here, which is that little ridge that runs from your nose to your upper lip. It's pretty deep, which shows a deep well of energy and stamina, similarly to the thick eyebrows. It's quite narrow, which shows a strong moral impulse. He puts principles over pleasure. Finally, it's pretty short, which means that he is disinclined to motor activity. Finally, we're going to look at a very important feature on his face because he is a professional broadcaster and live streamer. His mouth, which tells us about his communication style. It's slightly wide, which shows that he is more talkative and sociable than average, but his lips are quite thin. And when you have someone with a pretty wide mouth but thin lips, it means that they're talking a lot, but they're being very measured with what they say. They're not speaking necessarily from the heart. They're calculating what they say, because a thin upper lip stands for hesitancy in communication with the outside world. They don't immediately trust the outside world and others, and so they measure and guard what they let out and how they express what they truly think and feel deep down. Likewise for the lower lip with the inner self. A thin lower lip shows a lack of communication and a poor relationship with the inner self, not really knowing what you really want or how you really feel about something. Back to his upper lip real quick. It looks like it has a high and narrow arch shape. This is the moon upper lip, which means that his communication style is somewhat dreamy, poetic, very flowery and verbose and imaginative. This is the natural upper lip shape for someone with green eyes. Both the corners of his mouth are downturned, which means that he is generally pessimistic in both personal and professional affairs. And finally, it looks like he has a slight gap between his teeth, which goes well with those wide-splayed ears. It means that he does not care about society's expectations for him. The last facial feature that I will point out is that vertical crease in between his eyebrows. That is a worry crease or a line of frustration. That shows some sort of frustration or worry in his life. It's on the left side of his face, which would indicate that it is a past frustration, something in his personal life. It could have to do with his career somewhat indirectly, but it's more in the past than in the present. But no matter what it is, more likely than not, it is some sort of past frustration rather than a present worry. Alright, last thing we're going to do is break down his facial asymmetry. I alluded to this before with talking about his inner and outer persona and how he kind of hides his power level. This is a composite image of two left sides of his face. You can see here the sharply arched eyebrows. He looks very confident, very driven, very kind of aggressive and masculine. This is his inner self. This is his true self. This is who he really is deep down, and it shows in his personal life and in private. But then compare and contrast that to the right side of his face. This is, like I said, his outer persona. What does persona mean? Persona is the Latin word for mask. It is the mask that he puts on to present himself to the world. So we can say that deep down he is a much more aggressive, driven warrior type, very dedicated to his cause, whether that is Catholicism, white nationalism, America First, populism, whatever that may be. But he has this outer persona that presents it in this very friendly, Venusian, peacemaking sort of way, where he'll go on the podcast and he'll put on the hoodie and he'll say, hey, I'm just a regular old American like you, but I just have some concerns about Israel. Not saying there's necessarily anything insidious with that. Most effective political actors do something like that. You're very locked in private, but then in public you present yourself as a much more moderate and common sense, friendlier kind of guy. Alright, so that concludes my physiognomy analysis on Nicholas J. Fuentes. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and make sure you leave a comment letting me know which celebrity I should do a physiognomy analysis of next. This video was done in response to a comment by NeverAgain125 under my last video. Thank you for requesting that. Thank you for leaving that comment. And the top comment under this video will be the next celebrity reading I do. This has been Taylor from Persopa Insights, reminding you to always judge a book by its cover. Thank you for watching.
It's just the same old thing.